At 6:24 p.m. on September 17, 2014, Lisa Ann Coleman became the 15th woman executed in the United States since the death penalty's reinstatement. Her final words were simple: "Love you all." But those 3 words carried the weight of an unthinkable betrayal that had shocked even veteran investigators a decade earlier. When 9-year-old Davontae Williams was found dead in July 2004, he weighed less than 40 pounds, a skeletal frame that spoke of prolonged, deliberate starvation. The medical examiner determined his death was a homicide caused by malnutrition, but the true horror lay in who was responsible for his care. Lisa Ann Coleman, 38, had been convicted of the capital murder of her girlfriend's son, Davonte Marcel Williams. How does a caregiver become a killer? How does someone entrusted with a child's welfare orchestrate their slow death through starvation? The answers lie in a story that exposes the darkest corners of human nature, where dependency becomes weaponized and trust becomes fatal. What drove Lisa Ann Coleman to starve a helpless child? And in those final moments before the lethal injection, did her simple declaration of love carry genuine remorse or remain as hollow as the promises she'd made to keep Devonte safe? This is the story of a betrayal so profound that it cost 2 lives, one taken by starvation, the other claimed by the state in the name of justice. Devonte Marcel Williams entered the world on June 13, 1995, born into circumstances that would define the tragic arc of his brief existence. His mother, Marcella Williams, was just 14 years old when she gave birth, a child herself tasked with raising a child. The challenges began immediately, with Child Protective Services investigating the Williams household 7 times, beginning in 1995 when Marcella was 14 and Devonte was 2 months old. The boy who should have been thriving in elementary school instead became trapped in a household where basic care transformed into systematic deprivation. Devonte's vulnerability stemmed not just from his age, but from his complete dependency on caregivers who would ultimately betray that trust. In a home where love and protection should have been guaranteed, he found himself at the mercy of adults who viewed his needs as burdens rather than responsibilities. The pattern of neglect had become so normalized within the household that neighbors and potential witnesses remained largely unaware of the horror unfolding behind closed doors. On the morning of July 26, 2004, Marcella Williams called 911, reporting that her 9-year-old son, Devonte, was having breathing difficulty. Paramedic Troy Brooks arrived moments later at Williams' Arlington apartment to find the boy lying on the bathroom floor wearing only a diaper and bandages. Child was so emaciated and underweight that he had the appearance of a child 3 to 5 years old. When Devonte died, he was 9 years old, weighed 35 pounds and had 250 scars on his body. There were infected wounds on his wrists and legs where he had been bound with plastic extension cords. The physical evidence told a story of prolonged suffering that had been methodically concealed from the outside world. Dr. Daniel Konzelman conducted the autopsy and determined that Devonte's death was a homicide and that the direct cause of death was malnutrition coupled with slight pneumonia. The medical examination revealed the extent of systematic starvation that had reduced a 9-year-old boy to a weight typical of a toddler. The discovery shocked investigators who had encountered numerous cases of child abuse throughout their careers. The evidence suggested not momentary cruelty or neglect, but sustained, deliberate deprivation that had continued for months, if not years. Davonte Williams had died alone on a bathroom floor, his brief life ending in circumstances that contradicted every principle of child protection and human dignity. Lisa Ann Coleman's path to becoming a child killer was marked by a series of criminal choices that escalated over time, creating a pattern of behavior that would ultimately prove fatal for a vulnerable 9-year-old boy. Born in 1976, Coleman's early adult years were characterized by repeated encounters with the criminal justice system, revealing a pattern of poor decision-making and disregard for legal boundaries. Her criminal history began in 1993 when she was convicted of cocaine possession with intent to deliver, earning her a 5-year prison sentence. Coleman had previous felony convictions in 1993 for cocaine possession and in 2000 for burglary. The burglary conviction in 2000 resulted in a 2-year sentence, though both times she was released on parole prior to serving her full term. Her prior occupation was listed as laborer, suggesting a life of economic instability that may have contributed to her criminal activities. Coleman's relationship with Marcella Williams began several years before the tragedy that would define both their lives. Lisa spent much of her time living with Marcella Williams, Devontae's mother. Lisa and Marcella were involved romantically and had been for several years. This romantic partnership would place Coleman in a position of authority and influence over Devontae's care, despite having no biological or legal relationship to the child. Coleman's living arrangement with Williams created a complex household dynamic, where she assumed a caregiving role without the legal responsibilities or emotional bonds that typically accompany child-rearing. Her criminal background suggested someone comfortable operating outside legal and social boundaries, while her history of substance-related offenses indicated potential struggles with addiction or judgment that could compromise her ability to care for a child. The relationship between Coleman and Williams represented more than a romantic partnership. It created a power structure within the household that would prove devastating for Devonte. Coleman's influence over Williams, combined with her established pattern of criminal behavior and documented history of child abuse, created conditions where systematic cruelty could flourish unchecked. The progression from Coleman's early criminal activities to child abuse revealed an escalating pattern of antisocial behavior. Her previous convictions for drug possession and burglary demonstrated a willingness to violate social norms and legal boundaries, while her documented abuse of Devonte in 1999 showed a specific targeting of the most vulnerable member of the household. By 2004, Coleman had established herself as a dominant figure in the Williams household, wielding authority over a child who had already been identified as an abuse victim. The systematic torture and starvation of Davontae Williams represented one of the most methodical and prolonged acts of child abuse documented in Texas criminal history. What unfolded within the Arlington apartment shared by Lisa and Coleman, Marcella Williams, and her 3 children was not momentary cruelty, but a calculated campaign of deprivation that targeted the most vulnerable member of the household. The apartment maintained a pantry full of food and a refrigerator loaded with gallons of ice cream and frozen meat. Everyone in the apartment ate except for 9-year-old Devonte. This selective starvation revealed the deliberate nature of the abuse. While other children in the household received adequate nutrition, Devonte was systematically denied the basic sustenance necessary for survival. The partnership between Coleman and Williams created a household dynamic where both women participated in the abuse. During the ensuing investigation, Coleman told authorities that she sometimes struck Devonte with a belt and that sometimes, with the help of Marcella Williams, she tied Devonte up. This collaboration between the child's biological mother and her romantic partner represented a complete breakdown of the protective instincts that should have shielded Devonte from harm. The physical restraint of the child became a routine aspect of the abuse. There were infected wounds on his wrists and legs where he had been bound with plastic extension cords. The use of ligatures to restrain a 9-year-old child demonstrated both the premeditated nature of the abuse and the systematic approach to preventing the child from accessing food or seeking help. A police investigator and a pediatrician observed ligature marks around his wrists and ankles that were consistent with him being bound repeatedly. The evidence suggested that the abuse escalated over time, with injuries accumulating across months of systematic cruelty. When Devonte died, he had 250 scars on his body. A police investigator and a pediatrician observed over 250 wounds on Devonte's corpse, including a disfigured ear, swollen hands, a cut lip, and cigar or cigarette burns. These injuries represented not singular acts of violence, but a pattern of sustained abuse that continued until the child's death. The medical examiner's findings revealed how the abuse interfered with basic biological functions. It would tend to dribble out. The deliberate infliction of injuries that prevented eating transformed the child's mouth into an instrument of his own starvation. The final days of Devonte's life unfolded with tragic inevitability. At the time of his death, Devonte was suffering from pneumonia. His weakened immune system, compromised by months of malnutrition, could not fight off basic infections that a healthy child would easily overcome. On July 26, 2004, Marcella Williams found her 9-year-old son Devonte unconscious and called 911. Paramedics found the lifeless, starved corpse of Devonte on the bathroom floor wearing only a diaper. The discovery of a 9-year-old child reduced to such a state represented the culmination of a crime that had unfolded over months, witnessed by 2 adults who had chosen cruelty over care, starvation over sustenance, and death over the protection that every child deserves. The investigation into Davontae Williams' death began the moment paramedics discovered his emaciated body on July 26, 2004. Law enforcement officers documented a crime scene that revealed systematic abuse spanning months. The forensic evidence painted a comprehensive picture of prolonged starvation and physical torture that would become central to the prosecution's case. Dr. Daniel Konzelman's autopsy findings provided the medical foundation for criminal charges. His determination that the death was a homicide caused by malnutrition, combined with the documentation of over 250 wounds and ligature marks, established the deliberate nature of the abuse. The forensic evidence demonstrated that Devonte's injuries were not accidental, but resulted from sustained, intentional cruelty. Coleman's case came first, with a jury finding her guilty of capital murder in June 2006 and sentencing her to death. The prosecution built their case on the overwhelming physical evidence and testimony revealing the systematic nature of the abuse. While a Tarrant County jury convicted and sent Coleman to death row, Williams took a plea bargain and accepted a life prison sentence. The defense presented mitigating circumstances during the penalty phase. Coleman's lawyers argued that Coleman had bipolar disorder, attempting to establish mental illness as a factor that should spare her from execution. However, the jury rejected these mitigating circumstances, determining that the evidence of deliberate cruelty outweighed any psychological explanations. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed the conviction and sentence in December 2009, and all subsequent appeals in state and federal court were denied. The legal system's response reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the systematic cruelty documented in the case, culminating in the ultimate punishment available under Texas law. Lisa Ann Coleman spent 8 years on death row with a Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas, exhausting all available appeals before her execution date arrived. The appeals process concluded when the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals affirmed both her conviction and death sentence, with federal courts subsequently rejecting her constitutional challenges. On September 17, 2014, Coleman was transported from death row to the Huntsville unit for execution. She was offered a final meal of either chicken or pork and spent the morning talking with visitors, occasionally crying, and at other times laughing. For her last meal, Lisa Coleman was served a fried pork chop, macaroni and cheese, carrots, green beans, navy beans, sliced bread, and pineapple orange cake, with a choice of tea, punch, or water to drink. At 6:24 p.m., Coleman was pronounced dead by lethal injection. Coleman looked at her family and friends and spoke to them through the glass window of the execution chamber as she laid strapped to the gurney. "I just want to tell my family I love them. My son, I love him," Coleman began her last statement. Her final words contained no acknowledgement of Davontae Williams or expression of remorse for the crime that brought her to the execution chamber. Coleman became the 6th woman executed in Texas since 1982 and the 15th woman executed in the United States in the modern era. Her execution marked the 30th execution in the United States in 2014 and the 517th execution in Texas since 1976. The case represented a significant moment in Texas death penalty history, demonstrating the state's commitment to pursuing ultimate punishment for the most heinous crimes against children. Coleman's execution closed a decade-long legal chapter that began with the discovery of Davontae Williams' starved body and concluded with the state's final judgment on those responsible for his systematic torture and death. Justice was served, but a child's life was lost. The system failed Devonte before it finally answered for his suffering. The execution of Lisa Ann Coleman on September 17, 2014, marked the end of a legal process that began with the discovery of systematic child abuse and concluded with the state's ultimate punishment. Yet the finality of lethal injection could not restore the life of 9-year-old Davontae Williams or undo the months of starvation and torture that preceded his death. The case exposed critical failures in child protection systems that had multiple opportunities to intervene. Despite 7 investigations by Child Protective Services and the documented removal of Devonte from his mother's custody in 1999 due to Coleman's abuse, the system ultimately failed to prevent the escalation that led to his death. These systemic breakdowns represent more than bureaucratic failures. They constitute a collective abandonment of society's most vulnerable members. Coleman's final words, expressing love for her own family while offering no acknowledgement of Devonte or remorse for her crimes, underscored the profound disconnect between her capacity for selective affection and her systematic cruelty toward a helpless child. The contrast between her concern for her own son and her treatment of Devonte revealed the calculated nature of her crimes.